winding cliff-top paths.
But in the late 18th century, Cornwall became famous for something else: smuggling. And this wasn't just a few lawless sailors, it involved everyone.
I want to discover why smuggling became a way of life in Cornwall, and what would finally bring it to an end. For visitors like me, the romantic image of the Cornish smuggler fits perfectly with this stunning coastline. The southwest coast path will be my starting point for this journey through Cornwall's criminal past.
In the 18th century, smuggling was so big in Cornwall that half of all the brandy drunk in this country was smuggled in illicitly through this area. It was so huge that the national economy was threatened.
I've come here to dig the dirt and discover how this illicit industry actually operated. Starting with the origins of smuggling in the fishing village of Port Wrinkle, day one of this 4-day walk takes me to the fishing port of Looe. Day two, and I'll be heading from Talland to Polperro, where smuggling became big business. Then on to Lantic Bay and Polruan to discover how this illegal trade became part of Cornish culture. From Foy, where I get the boat to Mevagissey, I head into the period of the Napoleonic Wars and the government's crackdown on contraband. Then, continuing round the Roseland Peninsula, the final day of my walk takes me to the smuggler's last hurrah in Port Scatho. Finally, I go on to Falmouth Bay and the 1840s for the end of Cornwall's black market economy. I'm beginning my walk heading into Port Wrinkle, a tiny fishing village 10 miles west of Plymouth. 250 years ago, a massive crime wave hit this stretch of the Cornish coast, and almost everyone in sleepy villages like this became involved in a giant smuggling racket. Astonishingly, they'd ended up living a life of crime because they depended on catching one particular type of fish.
Pilchards, known locally as liquid gold and known everywhere else as big sardines. The fortunes of everyone in Port Wrinkle depended on a tiny window of opportunity between the late summer and the early autumn, when shoals of the little fish appeared off that coast.
The vast majority of Cornish pilchards were exported to the Mediterranean, and this required tons of salt to preserve them. But in the late 18th century, the pilchard fishermen faced ruin when a series of massive tax rises sent the cost of everyday items rocketing.
The tax on tea was 110%. There were 18 different duties on brandy and gin, totalling around about 250%. The tax burden on ordinary people was enormous, but all that was dwarfed by what was happening around here. In order to preserve pilchards, you needed salt, but not just any sort of salt. You needed the really good stuff from Brittany and from Spain. But the tax on that salt reached 40 times the value of the salt itself. Of course, ordinary people couldn't afford to pay that kind of money. The people around here were threatened with starvation.
Yet a day or two sailing away in France and the Channel Islands, salt, and all the other things now subject to massive tax hikes, were a fraction of the price. The scene was set for a smuggling explosion here, or as the locals called it, Cornish free trade. To try and understand how it became a way of life here, I'm calling into the aptly named Smuggler's Cottage to see Margaret Bartlett, whose ancestor great-uncle Harry became Port Wrinkle's most notorious smuggler 200 years ago.
What did he smuggle?
All sorts of contraband, I suppose, brandy and silk and tea and...
Where did he get it from?
France. He used to meet a French boat halfway across the channel, and then they would exchange contraband, I suppose, and he'd pay them. Then he would row and sail back in.
Where did he put it?
Well, there was a big hole in this passage.
Oh, this wasn't an open room?
No, there was a passage,
yeah.
And they put a lot there. And in one of the back rooms, there was a little hole that I knew as a child, just big enough for a keg of brandy, with a stone slab on the top.
What happened to him?
Well, we think he might have been caught because some in the family think he was a turncoat and...
So he was arrested and then dobbed everyone?
We don't really know for sure.
Why do you think that?
Because he was ostracised. He was sent to Loo.
Which is how far away?
It's 8 miles by sea from here.
So it wasn't the worst punishment in the world, was it?
No.
Thanks ever so much.
Thank you, Tony. Happy journey. Bye.
See ya.
The high taxes that fishermen like Uncle Harry worked so hard to dodge had been introduced because of something we're all too familiar with today.
A massive financial crisis. 250 years ago, thanks to events in America, the national debt had spiralled, the government was desperately short of money, and the cost of living was rocketing. Some things never change, do they?
This particular crisis had come about because of the American War of Independence. For 8 years, Britain had fought an expensive war to keep the colonies she relied on for the bulk of her trade. When France and Spain joined in on the American side, Britain lost, and the nation now teetered on the edge of bankruptcy. Leaving Port Wrinkle, my walk takes me up onto the cliff tops and along the southwest coast path. This used to be the main route to my next destination, the fishing port of Loo.
Oh, it's like a sauna inside this jacket, which is probably information you don't want to know, but that's the thing about these Cornish walks. You never know what the weather's likely to bring. See those rocks down there? They're called the Brandies, and they're where the smugglers used to hide their contraband offshore so that the revenue couldn't get hold of it. The clue's in the name.
The weather seems to have picked up today, but in the 1780s, the economic storm battering Britain put the government in a desperate position. There was no such thing as income tax, so the only way to raise money to pay the national debt was through the high duties that the Cornish smugglers were now avoiding.
Hi, Tony.
Bit of a schlep up that hill, isn't it?
Historian Sam Willis is going to help me get my head round how bad Britain's finances really were.
What was the level of debt that the government at the time were lumbered with? How does it compare to what's been going on here over the last few years?
It was far bigger than the credit crunch at its worst. It was a bigger debt than we had at the end of the Second World War. We'd been supplying a huge army and navy fighting a war 3,000 miles away. So at the end of the 1780s, the debt was enormous. Now, the problem they really faced is that as much as 20% of government income was being lost through smuggling.
So what did the government do about it?
They used the excise men, and they set up the Southwest Coast Path, was a route to enable people to police these beaches.
So how would the revenue men have operated?
There would have been a handful of men dotted along the coast, but here at Port Wrinkle, the nearest one's 7 miles away up there.
So it would have been pretty easy to smuggle with impunity.
Very easy, and even if you were spotted, it was almost impossible for people to get the excise men to you before all of the smuggled goods would literally vanish inland.
Heading off for Loo, so maybe I'll bump into a revenue man on the way.
Good luck, it might
Cheers.
search your bag.
Walking this remote coastal path, you get a real sense of how hard enforcing the law here must have been. Cornwall is pretty much surrounded entirely by the sea. It's almost an island, and 200 years ago it thought of itself as another country with its own distinct language and culture. From here, it would take 5 days by stagecoach to London. So when Westminster imposed these massive tax hikes, few people in Cornwall had any qualms turning to smuggling to survive.
Smuggling in the 18th and 19th century had an incredible impact on our culture. You can see it in our language today. There are phrases like, the coast is clear and above board, a load of them that derive from smuggling. But for me, the most evocative description of the smuggling industry comes from a poet, from Rudyard Kipling. And I can just about recite it from memory because I learnt it for a poetry competition when I was a little boy. If you wake at midnight and hear a horse's feet, Don't go drawing back the blinds or looking in the street. Them that asks no questions isn't told a lie. Watch the wall, my darling, when the gentlemen go by. 25 ponies trotting through the dark, brandy for the parson, baccy for the clerk, laces for the lady, letters for a spy. Watch the wall, my darling, while the gentlemen go by.
This stretch of the coast path heading towards Looe is stunning on a warm, sunny afternoon. Back in the 1780s, what had started out as fishermen smuggling to survive quickly became a much bigger enterprise. Everyone realised serious money could be made. Just as I arrive in Looe, so does the rain. I'm here to discover how a big smuggling run would have operated. One man who should know is Mark Bullen.
Hello, Mark.
Hello, Tony.
Former customs officer and now a historian. He's taking me to the beach where the smugglers landed their contraband. Probably not the best idea on an afternoon like this.
Forget the beach, look at it. We're going to go down the pub.
So we retire to the Jolly Sailor, an infamous smuggler's watering hole.
How did smuggling work? How was it organised?
Well, it would start with the merchants in France, for example, or the Channel Islands, having goods to sell. English smugglers wanted those goods. So fairly quickly, the merchants would package the goods to be taken across the channel. So, for example, barrels would be strung together in special harnesses. Goods like tea and tobacco would be protected by oilskin coverings in case they came into contact with seawater.
How big would these consignments be?
A not unusual quantity would be about 500 barrels or half-anchor tubs. Now, a half-anchor was about 4.5 gallons of brandy or gin or rum or whatever. The smuggling lugger was too big to get right into the shore, so she would moor off the shore, and then they would have smaller boats that people would row out and unload as many barrels as they could. If there was a big landing coming up, it wasn't unusual to have as many as 400 or 500 men down on a beach.
I love the names of the people who were involved. You've got them on these cigarette cards, haven't you? What's this one?
This guy's a tub man. 2 of those could weigh as much as about 100 weight.
Here's another job with a special name.
Yeah, he's the batsman. They were used wherever the smugglers felt they might be under attack from revenue forces, should they appear.
This is my favourite because it's another example of how smuggling parlance has got into our language. The bootlegger.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, it was common in those days to wear these really, really big sea boots, which were very wide at the top and therefore had a lot of space around the leg to actually hide contraband.
I suppose that's what bootleg albums are. They're ways of avoiding tax.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's fascinating, isn't it? This division of labour, all these different jobs in a process like smuggling.
No sooner have I dried off and it's time to get wet again. I'm walking 4 miles to my last stop of the day, Talland. I'm off to see how this burgeoning black market economy would draw in some unlikely participants. The coast certainly looks dramatic in this weather. Not much of 18th century Talland remains, just a few houses and the church.
It is pretty spooky, isn't it? In the 18th century, they used to say that the Reverend Doidge, who was the vicar here, could summon up spirits, although the reality is the only spirits around here were the ones that were being smuggled in. Even the vicar was at it. But I want to know who was behind it. Who turned Cornwall's smuggling into big business?
Mitsubishi plug-in hybrid.
We're lucky enough to be surrounded by a dazzling coastline. And I'm looking forward to seeing some wonderful homes in amazing locations.
That's the star of the show, isn't it? I mean, that is a stunning view.
Brand new Homes by the Sea continues tonight at 9 on More 4.
Mitsubishi plug-in hybrid. Changing perceptions with documentaries on 4.
Day 2 of my walk along the edge of southern Cornwall. After a night in Talland, I've reached a gloriously sunny Talland Bay on my quest to reveal the secrets of the county's smuggling past.
I'm heading for Polperro, which 250 years ago became the centre of one of Britain's biggest ever smuggling rackets.
I'm off to discover who the brains behind it were. So today, it's a short walk on to Polperro, then it's westwards to Lantic Bay, before ending this 8-mile hike in Polruan. In 1783, the government was forced out as a consequence of the loss of the American War of Independence. With the economy in tatters, a hastily formed coalition took over to try and stop Britain from going bust. At its head was the youngest Prime Minister in our history.
Stopping smuggling became the #1 priority of the ridiculously young new Prime Minister, William Pitt. He was 24 years old. In 1784, he managed to persuade Parliament to cut the tax on tea, and almost overnight, tea smuggling around here dried up, tea sales tripled, and the government was quids in because of all the tax revenue it made.
But changes like this took time to work, and Pitt was forced to throw his plans for financial reform out of the window, overtaken by events on the other side of the Channel. In 1789, the French Revolution led to crisis in Europe, when the new republic tried to overthrow the neighbouring monarchies. Within 4 years, revolutionary France declared war on Britain. The government now needed huge amounts of cash, and fast, to pay the troops. Sky-high taxes would have to go even higher, but that just pushed up the demand for cheap smuggled imports from France and the Channel Islands. For the people of Polperro, the conflict would present the chance to transform smuggling into a really big business.
No one was ever able to find out who'd been behind Polperro's move into 18th century big-time crime until a local historian found an old tin box, and inside it there were loads of letters and accounts which detailed the village's smuggling activities. It also revealed the man who'd been able to make the whole thing possible. His name was Zephaniah Job, otherwise known as the smuggler's banker.
Job started out doing the books for the fishermen turned smugglers here, but he soon took over and began masterminding Polperro's transformation from sleepy fishing village to the centre of a vast international smuggling syndicate. To get out of this rain, I'm heading to the pub where the papers were found to meet author Jeremy Rowett-Johns, who's been looking over Job's books.
Well, they give you an extraordinary insight into the trade that was carried on between the merchants in Guernsey, who supplied the goods, the fishermen over here who smuggled them in, the customers who were the gentry, and the agents in London who shipped the money back to Guernsey.
And it was Zephaniah who was orchestrating this?
He did, because he was one of the few people who could read and write in Polperro.
Show me some of the evidence.
This, for example, this is his account book, and the sums of money are extraordinary. I mean, we're talking here just short of 4 figures. Add a couple of noughts on for present-day values, and you're talking about tens of thousands of pounds being pushed through the books.
What happened to Zephaniah?
He made so much money out of the smuggling trade that he went on to found his own bank. He was known as the smuggler's banker and had his own banknotes printed, and here you've got a couple of examples of them.
Is that his signature?
That is, indeed, yes.
There must have been loads of money swilling around Polperro.
They were making serious sums of money.
What did they do with it?
A lot of it was invested back into bigger and better boats. There was a smuggling vessel that was owned by people in Polperro here and crewed by Polperro men, called the Lottery. Not unlike this vessel here, for example. In fact, this is an artist impression of what the Lottery is. I mean, you can see it's got quite a substantial crew. It's armed and built for speed. They had to run the gauntlet of the revenue men across the Channel.
This one looks fantastically dramatic, doesn't it?
Well, that's it. It got involved in a tragic incident where it was caught red-handed unloading goods near Plymouth, there was a standoff. A customs officer was rowing out to apprehend it.
Oh, yes, you can see a gun there, can't you?
A shot is being fired that kills one of the oarsmen.
Yeah.
And the lottery then escapes.
Did Zephaniah get fingered for this?
No. Nobody ever fingered Zephaniah. He was a clever man.
The really bad guys never get their just desserts, do they?
But I don't think anybody in Polperro thought of him as a bad guy. But no, he never got caught.
That's so fascinating. Thanks ever so much. You can imagine, can't you, in all these houses, consignments of brandy and gin and tobacco and lace. And when the revenue men come by, the doors swing shut and there's just a polite face at the window.
I want to discover why so few of the thousands implicated in this massive county-wide conspiracy ever seem to get caught. I'm heading for one of Cornwall's hidden gems, Lantic Bay. Even on a bit of a damp, grey afternoon, it's an enjoyable 6-mile hike along the coast path to get here. 200 years ago, Lantic Bay's secluded beach was the scene of a dramatic smuggling bust. In the dead of night, a 100-strong gang of smugglers were seen unloading tons of contraband by 2 revenue men on patrol. They quickly called for reinforcements and then went down to arrest the smugglers.
Hi, Mark. Hi.
Local historian Mark Camp knows what happened next.
The customs men lay in wait for the smugglers coming up. There was a skirmish, a bit of a struggle. One of the customs men was knocked unconscious by a smuggler armed with a stick like this. But they managed to arrest 5 of them.
Just 5?
Yeah, just 5.
Out of 100?
Out of 100, yeah.
And what did they do with them?
They were sent to court before a Cornish jury. The defence stated that they weren't dangerous weapons, they were just Commonwealth garden sticks that all Cornishmen carry when they're marching along the coast path.
Rather like you are now?
Yeah, yeah.
So were they found not guilty?
They were found not guilty, yeah.
It is extraordinary, isn't it? How
it is, yeah.
Cornish people just all banded together.
They say a Cornish jury never, ever found a smuggler guilty. I think it's partly to do with the Cornish being cut off from the rest of England.
What was the government's reaction to the fact that so much smuggling was going on and no one was getting busted?
Well, partly they started sort of taking the smugglers up to London to try them, so they weren't. The Cornish juries could have no say in it.
But wasn't there a moral issue here? Surely the Cornish people realised that what they were doing was wrong.
I think they did, but they didn't really worry about that sort of thing. They were breaking a law which was forced on them by a government 300 miles away.
But there must have been revenue men living around them. How did they treat them?
Not very well. It's said that when they first came to Polperro, they made them live in a boat in the middle of the harbour. You know, they weren't allowed actually onto dry land. They weren't liked.
So there was a degree of tension.
Much so, yes.
Thanks for telling me. That's great. Yeah, careful with that stick.
Yeah, that's all right. Cheers.
My walk for today is almost over. From Lantic Bay, it's 1.5 miles along the coast path to Polruan, my stop for the night. It really has struck me today just how ingrained smuggling had become in Cornish culture. It had been going on here almost with impunity throughout 7 years of war with France. Then in 1799, Napoleon seized power. With the whole republic under his control, the threat of a French invasion soon became very real. Britain would need big money to defend herself.
But by the end of the 18th century, smuggling was no longer simply a clash of cultures. As the fighting with France intensified, it became a serious drain on the national exchequer. It was time for a new level of enforcement.
Shogun, changing perceptions with documentaries on 4.
Day 3, and it's back on with my boots for my next step into the smuggling history of Cornwall. Today, my journey is taking me into the 19th century and the period of the Napoleonic Wars. I'll be heading by boat to the smuggling hotspots of Foy and Mevagissey, To explore how, under threat of a French invasion, the government desperately tried to put the brakes on Cornwall's runaway black market economy. But I'm beginning the day with a gentle stroll through Polruan to take in its stunning views of Foy across the harbour.
Can you see on the waterline over there a white house? That once belonged to Polruan's most famous resident, Daphne du Maurier, the novelist, the one who wrote Rebecca and The Birds, which Hitchcock later made into a film, and Jamaica Inn, which was about a famous smuggling pub on Bodmin Moor.
I can't hang around here for too long as I've got to catch the ferry. 200 years ago, Foy was the front line in the government's fight back against Cornish smugglers. As war against Napoleon raged, the smugglers around here were trading with the enemy on a huge scale, supporting the French economy while depriving Britain of much-needed tax money. To put a stop to it, the revenue dispatched one of their fastest and most heavily armed cutters under the command of their top man, Captain Gabriel Bray.
His orders were hunt down the smugglers, capture them, or kill them. Oh, yeah.
Luckily for him, Bray's boat was a bit quicker than the Foy ferry. These days, Foy is still a working deep-water port, but when Bray first arrived here, it was just starting to become a hive of activity. As ships from around the country arrived to collect Cornwall's mineral riches.
There was tin and iron ore feeding Britain's industrial revolution. And all along there would have been shipyards churning out luggers and schooners for the growing merchant navy. Thank you.
Although there were now lots of legitimate jobs here, smuggling was still a big part of life and the economy of Foy. And they're still proud of their smuggling heritage today.
For instance, this pub isn't named after the real King of Prussia, but after an 18th century Cornish smuggler who looked a bit like the King of Prussia. That's the kind of person that Foy wanted to celebrate. So you can imagine how shocked and horrified the people here would have been when they realised that Captain Bray and his state-of-the-art revenue cutter were about to be stationed slap bang in the middle of their harbour.
Bray had already earned a fearsome reputation fighting smugglers in Kent.
Good to see you.
Historian Steve Butler has got the Revenue Service Silver Cup that proves it.
Why did he get a cup?
Because of an incident that happened off the port of Deal in Kent. There's a fight on board a smuggler's vessel, and in the ensuing fight, Bray practically removes the head of the smuggler with a swipe of his cutlass.
And this is a cutlass like the one that he would have used?
Yes, something very, very similar. Everybody was armed, heavily armed, so it's very likely it could have been used by a customs officer. Equally likely it could have been used by a smuggler, and maybe abandoned on the roadside.
And both sides might have had something like this?
Yeah. Flintlock pistol. That was standard issue.
What's this one?
This is a dagger which was found in a Cornish cave that was used for hiding goods.
What it does show is really quite how serious the battles must have been between the smugglers and the revenue.
Oh, yes. Absolutely serious.
How successful was he? Did he capture any ships?
He did. In a very short time. In about 5 months, about 3 smuggling vessels were captured and cut into 3. And their timbers auctioned off on the slipway. And eventually, he found a lottery.
From Polperro?
Yes. The lottery was a key smuggling vessel. An earlier event had resulted in the death of a customs officer, and Bray went in pursuit. And this chase goes on for, through the night. It goes on for about 24 hours. At some point, they're becalmed. The sun starts to come up, and they realise they're only about 100 metres apart. The crew on the lottery take to their boats and try and avoid arrest, at which point the Hind fires its cannon. And the lottery crew realise their time's up.
Does he saw it up into bits too?
No, no. The lottery was such a good vessel, they recommissioned it, and it serves in the customs service as a customs cutter.
What happened to Bray?
He actually retires and buys a property on the Esplanade in Foy. He actually reverts to his original career as an artist.
This is him?
This is him.
It is an extraordinary self-portrait. I don't think I've ever seen a man drawing himself in such a feminine way in my life. Those long hands, sensitive face, hair tied up. It's bizarre.
It is. This squashbuckling figure beheading smugglers then becomes an artist in retirement.
I'd be one of those smugglers. I'd have shoved him in the water, I think.
Yes.
This is the esplanade where Bray retired to. I wonder if that was his house.
Men like Bray saw Cornish smugglers as traitors, putting English gold directly into Napoleon's pockets. Cutting off their supply routes now became part of the war effort, and for the smugglers, outrunning the fast, well-armed revenue ships was no longer an option.
So as the new century approached, the smugglers were going to have to come up with some radical new strategy to get their contraband on shore if they wanted to continue to make money.
And that's exactly what they did at my next port of call. This time, rather than walk 17 miles around St Austell Bay, I'm taking the hour-long ferry ride to Mevagissey, once one of the biggest smuggling towns in Cornwall. Once we're out of the harbour, the conditions get a bit rough. Back in 1805, life was about to get rougher for the smugglers around here. That year, Nelson destroyed the French fleet at Trafalgar and thus assured British naval supremacy. And within weeks, the Channel Islands bowed to government pressure, halting duty-free sales and closing their free ports to smugglers.
And at a stroke, the Cornish smugglers had lost one of their main supply bases. Meanwhile, over in Brittany, Napoleon had decided to make Roscoff a free port. This was a shrewd little ruse to attract the Cornish smugglers.
Stopping them now became even more of a priority for the revenue. Mevagissey had made a fortune from smuggling, but in the face of this clampdown, the days of openly landing big shiploads of contraband were over. But historian Helen Doe has unearthed how the town's smugglers came up with ways to fool the revenue men.
They then had to move to more hidden methods, whereas before it had been completely open. And this is where the shipwright skill really came into being. I've got an illustration for you. This is a cutaway section, sliced through a boat.
Yeah.
And you've got here, underneath the ballast, you've got a sort of double skin in the base of the boat, and that's barrels stashed away in there.
Cool, you'd be able to hide a lot of barrels like that, wouldn't you? Where did this come from?
This came from a customs officer in 1830 who felt that he needed to pull together intelligence for his fellow customs officers to show what to look for.
I love this. It's a plan of a false bottom. So you could hide the stuff when it was on board, but you've still got to get it from the sea to the land.
Very good point, because you can't bring it in openly into a place like Mevagissey and just unload it. Well, they'd bring the barrels close enough to shore.
Hang on, so we're under the water here?
Yes, you're underwater. You've got an anchor either side.
The barrels are floating.
Indeed. And they're being kept down by carefully made sinking stones, as they were called.
What are sinking stones?
I have one here. There we are. One heavy sinking stone with a neat hole in it so that you can pin down the barrels.
And that's genuine? That would have been used for smuggling?
Absolutely, yes.
Despite all these smart little tricks, smuggling was getting smaller.
It was getting far riskier, and so there were fewer men involved in it altogether.
Sounds like there were really big changes going on.
There were indeed.
At the beginning of the 19th century, Cornwall had established itself as one of the world's leading exporters of tin and copper. The Industrial Revolution was transforming lives here, and the mindset of the people was changing with it.
There was a big shift in the whole moral attitude. We're here between two very large Methodist chapels, one there and one over there. They are enormous. And as Methodism grew enormously in the 19th century, it becomes the wrong thing to do. Whereas before everyone was involved, now it was really frowned upon.
Why do you think the Cornish were so attracted by Methodism and nonconformism generally?
Methodism offered opportunities for education and opportunities for the working man to better himself. And it became a very big growth movement.
And smuggling, now it was just taboo.
Definitely not the thing to do. And it's left to a smaller and smaller group of men to engage in.
Leaving Mevagissey, I'm finally going to get the chance to do some proper walking today.
I started off the day over beyond that red and white tower thing over there in Foy, and I've come all the way to here.
My route this afternoon is firmly on dry land. It's 12 miles of unsport coastline to Portloo, my final destination for the day. The mineral-rich granite that made Cornwall's 19th century mines so profitable also created all these secluded coves the smugglers came to depend upon to secretly land their contraband. Negotiating the winding path around them is one of the things that makes this walk to Portloo so enjoyable. And even here in this tiny village, I can see the two forces that are now making smuggling in Cornwall much harder.
See that rather nice house over there? That was built in 1824 for the revenue, and originally it would have had a watch station and a boathouse, and you can still see the remnants of a slipway down there, all very efficient. But round about the same time, on the far side of the village, you can still see the Methodist Hall. So not only was smuggling getting much harder to operate, it was also getting much harder to justify. But it wasn't over yet.
So tomorrow, I'll be heading to Falmouth Bay to discover how a new global economic order would finally kill off Cornwall's black market. I'm beginning the final day of my walk through Cornwall, heading into the dying days of smuggling here. At the start of the 19th century, the cost of the Napoleonic Wars had forced the government to crack down on Cornish smugglers, while the rise of Methodism here was increasingly making it socially unacceptable. The political and moral tide may be turning against them, but a small number of hardcore smugglers around here refused to give up. So to discover how they kept their illicit industry alive, today I'll be heading 6 miles along the coast to Port Scatho. Then it's round St Anthony Head, onto St Mawes and a great view of Falmouth Bay, and the events that would finally put an end to smuggling in Cornwall. Almost 2 centuries ago, the British Army fought one of the most famous and decisive battles in our history. And the outcome had a profound effect on life along this remote stretch of coastline.
Wellington's victory over the French at Waterloo in 1815 was a black day for Cornwall's black market economy. After 20 years of constant fighting, peace had been declared and 300,000 soldiers and sailors came home. Pretty soon, this coastal path, that little town out there, the sea, they were all being patrolled by a brand new battle-hardened customs force.
In 1822, bolstered by veterans of the Napoleonic Wars, the various branches of the revenue were amalgamated to form the Coast Guard Service. Suddenly, the smugglers found themselves confronted by well-paid, well-equipped professionals, determined to put them out of business for good. It's a 3-hour stroll round the Roseland Peninsula to reach Port Scatho, my first port of call of the day.
Despite being faced by the might of the newly formed customs service, smugglers in little villages like this one, Port Scatho, weren't going to give up their nice little earner without a fight.
How the smugglers here reacted to the arrival of the Coast Guards is something Cornish sailor Ian Hurd knows all about.
How did the people around here cope with it?
Well, they would have coped very badly. Smuggling was important to the economy. But with the customs service, they had a lot more men.
Better trained men, I suppose.
Better trained men. They'd been with Nelson at Trafalgar. These guys knew what they were doing. They were a lot more Navy ships in the Channel anyway. So the men would have turned to boats like this, their gigs.
Hang on, they turned from sailing vessels to tiny little glorified rowing boats?
Well, they are glorified rowing boats, they are. They've been designed over centuries to take the sea.
Yeah, but if a big revenue ship came bearing down on one of those, it wouldn't stand a chance, would it?
Yeah, but a sailing ship can't go straight into the wind. You just can't do that. So to move forward in a sailing boat, you have to tack, you have to zigzag this way and that. For every mile a gig can row straight into the wind, a sailing boat is going to do, I don't know, 9, 10 miles.
So that's got a bit of pace on it?
Oh, yeah, they'll go. Hey, gig! Can you give us a run?
How far would they have gone in one of those things to do their smuggling?
They would have gone out into this channel to meet ships coming up and drop cargo over the side, contraband. But they would go all the way to France, to be honest.
That's about 100 miles, isn't it?
It is 40 hours.
Oh, I wouldn't fancy that, would you?
Not a bit of it, to be honest. It's a long way in a small boat.
Yeah. How often would they do this?
A gig called the Bonnet in the Scillies is known to have gone to France 25 times. I mean, on one occasion, been stuck in a storm for 30 hours and just stayed there by rowing head to sea until it passed over, then they came home.
But what was the incentive? You couldn't carry much in one of those.
Well, you'd carry a small cargo of high-value stuff, silk, lace, tobacco. They're small packages you could sell quickly, but worth a lot of money. They can go a long way very quickly.
And you still do gig racing today?
It's very, very popular. It's a huge sport today.
Well, I'm going to go round to Falmouth now. Cheers, mate. Bye.
See ya.
Looking at that tiny gig, you can see why smuggling wasn't just becoming riskier. It must have been hard and dangerous work. Whereas once whole villages would openly carry vast shiploads of contraband off the beaches, by the end of the Napoleonic Wars, smuggling had been reduced to rowing small boats across the Channel. I'm heading to Falmouth Bay to see how this new era of peace would finally put an end to Cornish smuggling. It's a good morning's walk 5 miles along the cliff tops, but on the way there are some spectacular vantage points.
This is St Anthony's Head, and all this concrete is the site of a massive battery gun which was part of our Second World War defences. But on the self-same site, during the Napoleonic Wars, there was another gun here to defend Falmouth, which is just over there, from the French.
And just a few hundred metres further on is Falmouth Bay, the most southerly deep water port in Britain. From here, I'm in striking distance of St Mawes Castle, my lookout point over the bay. To get there, I need to make one last ferry trip across Place Creek.
There. Oh, there's just about room.
For centuries, Britain's economy had been geared for war. And this had created the high taxes that had made Cornish smuggling so profitable. But by the 1830s, this was beginning to change.
Thank you. In a way, I'm ending this walk as I began it, in a little Cornish fishing village that used to rely on pilchards for its survival.
It's a short walk along the waterfront to reach St Mawes Castle. For the first time in 300 years or so, Britain no longer faced the threat of a major invasion, and now big expensive defences like this were becoming redundant.
It's starting to be a chilly end to what's been the most gorgeous day, but in our story it's the sunny dawn of the Victorian era, where they're starting to discuss a radical new approach to the economy, one that is going to see an end to smuggling in Cornwall.
And it had been sparked by what was going on out there in great ports like Falmouth. By the mid-19th century, this harbour would hold up to 500 ships at a time, all laden with raw materials from around the world and all destined for British factories. It was a golden age for British industry. The nation now exported far more than she imported, so high import taxes were no longer in our interest. In 1842, the government introduced a policy of free trade, slashing the tax on imports. Overnight, a bottle of legal brandy became the same price as a black market one. And of course that was the end of smuggling in Cornwall. But it's not quite the end of Cornwall's smuggling story. Here in St Maur's Harbour, the old customs house is now a restaurant. The most fitting place to finish my walk with a stiff drink. Free trade may have stopped smuggling, but it didn't stop people making a profit out of smuggling. In the 1840s, some ex-smugglers started publishing their own memoirs, and these romantic tales of derring do became incredibly popular. In fact, so much so that they kick-started a whole new Cornish tourist industry, one that still fuels a lot of Cornwall today. As they say down here, when fishing scat, when farming scat, there's always smuggling, boys. Cheers. If you want to follow in my footsteps, you can download a guide to my walk by going to www.channel4.com.
Tonight at 9, the last episode of National Treasure over on Channel 4 is Paul Finchley found guilty or not guilty. At 9 o'clock here, a working lighthouse and a smuggler's cottage in Anglesey take Charlie's eye at New on Moor 4, and next Tim and Fuzz saving a 1968 Morris Traveller in Car SOS.